Hello and welcome to this Pali Studies tutorial. On this, the Learn Pali channel, where we focus on understanding the grammar of the Pali language. Now, in a previous tutorial, we looked at how the passive voice is formed in the English language. And in Pali, there's actually two ways of forming the passive voice. And we're going to look at both of these in this tutorial. In the previous tutorial, we looked at the paradigm shift required to understand the passive voice in English. We've seen that the noun in nominative case, the subject, does the action of the verb. And this is true, but only in active sentences. In a passive sentence, the action happens to the subject. That is, the noun which appears in nominative undergoes the action of the verb. When talking about the passive voice, it's useful to distinguish between grammatical terms, like subjects and objects, where the subject is who or what the sentence is about, and grammatically it's the noun with which the verb is in agreement, and semantic terms like agent and target, which is also sometimes called the patient. An agent actually does the action of the verb, and the target is the entity that endures or undergoes the action. In a passive voice sentence, the grammatical subject of the verb is the target of the action, and any agent is placed in a prepositional phrase. So that's a recap. Now in this tutorial, we're going to consider the passive voice in the Pali language. And the good news is that these rules that we've just seen hold for the passive voice in Pali too. So let's start with a simple Pali sentence in the active voice. First, the word order in Pali is generally subject, object, then verb. Though we don't have to stick with this, as the subject is placed in nominative case and any object is in the accusative. Here, ite, the woman, is in nominative case, as it's the subject of the verb and it's also the agent doing the action, which happens to be pachati, meaning to cook. And odanang, the rice, is in accusative case because it's the object of the verb and undergoes the action. So this sentence reads, the woman cooks the rice. So if we want to place this sentence in the passive voice, we have to make the rice the focus of the sentence. In effect, we make the object of the verb into the subject. So odana is placed in nominative case to become the subject, but it's not doing the action. In effect, it's controlling the verb. And the verb must be made to agree with this in person and number. But now in Pali, we can use one of two types of passive verb. We can use a specific passive form of the verb to cook, which is created by use of a secondary derivational infix, and this type of verb is sometimes referred to as the present passive or the passive indicative. But actually, in the early Buddhist texts, it's much more common to find the past participle used for the passive voice. We'll look at both these verb forms in a minute, but for now let's just stick with the passive indicative. No matter which type of verb form is used, any agent is placed in the instrumental case. So now if we examine this sentence, we can see that the direct object of the active voice verb, the noun in accusative case, has become the new subject, and it's placed in nominative. The verb is passive because it has the infix ya, and this verb has been inflected to agree in person and number with the new subject. And like a present tense verb, we use the primary personal endings to do this. Finally, the agent, which is in nominative case in the active sentence, is now placed in instrumental. And if we now translate this back into English, because the verb has a present tense ending, we use the present tense in English. So we get the rice is cooked, or even the rice is being cooked. Now, unless for some reason you're having to write Pali, it's unlikely that you'll need to transform an active voice into a passive voice. What's important when we're learning to read Pali is being able to recognise the passive voice when we see it. And because in Pali it's the verb which tends to indicate when the passive voice is being used, you can see how important it is to be able to recognise a passive voice verb. But this can actually be tricky to do because the passive infix ya often disappears into other parts of the verb. So now we're going to look in detail at how the present passive or the passive indicative verb is formed. Now, as is often the case with Pali, the passive indicative can be formed in several ways. The infix is always ya, and this can be placed on either the present stem or directly on the verb root. We've covered the difference between stems and roots in the tutorial on verb mechanics, but let's just have a quick refresher. In Pali, present tense verbs, that is, the present tense moods and the present tense participle, are formed on what is called the present stem, for example the verb bhava. And when we compare these to the other verb tenses, we can see that these verbs, and indeed the present stem itself, derive from a more basic form which is termed the verb root. In this case the root is bu, meaning to be. So when we're creating a passive verb, we can distinguish between the present stem form and the verb root form. So going back to our verb to cook, the passive indicative is formed on the present stem by the addition of ya with an interceding e, making a new base, pachiya. And on the verb root too, we can also add a version of iya, or the infix ya can be added directly to the root, in which case the consonants assimilate. Because Pali is a phonetic language, meaning that it's spelt how it is spoken, we often get the contraction of sounds and therefore of spelling. When two dissimilar consonants meet, the result is often a single sound, and this is called assimilation. In Pali, when the second consonant is a y, the result is often a duplication of the first consonant, the exception being t, which becomes ch, and d, which may become j. Another effect, which happens when ya is added to a h or an r, is called metathesis, and this simply means that the two consonant sounds are swapped around. Metathesis happens in English too. For instance, we say prescription instead of prescription, which is how it's spelt. So now if we look at some other passive indicative verbs, we can see how that passive infix ya, especially when added to the verb root, tends to disappear because it's been assimilated, often resulting in a doubling of the consonant. To these new passive bases, we still have to add a personal ending so that they will agree with their subject in both person and number. Theoretically, it's possible to add any verb tense to the passive verb base, but in practice, the only ones we find in the early Buddhist texts are those of the present indicative, which can be added to both the present stem form and the verb root form, the present participle, and some aorist and a couple of future forms. Let's now look at these last two in a bit more detail. To form the passive future base, we take a verb root and add to it the passive infix ya, and then to this we add the future infix issa. Finally, we add a primary personal ending to indicate person and number. So in third person we get it will be cooked. And a past tense or aorist passive is formed by taking a verb root, adding to it the passive infix ya to create a passive base, and then to this an aorist ending is added directly. Again, in practice, only the third person endings are found in the early Buddhist texts. So if we take the third person plural, we get they were cooked. So that's the present passive, or the passive indicative verb. It's actually fairly infrequent in the Pali Suttas. Much more common, like in English, is the use of the past participle. Now there'll be other tutorials on the use of participles, so I'm only going to cover them here briefly, so you can see how they work with the passive voice. Participles are curious things. They're part verb and part adjective. They're based on a verb root, and so convey tense and voice. But unlike verbs, they then decline in gender, number and case, and so behave like an adjective being made to agree with their subject in gender, number and case. They can be formed on either the present stem or more commonly the verb root with the addition of the infix ta. When this is placed on the present stem, a preceding I is added, whereas when added to a root, if the root ends in a vowel, ta is added directly without any change. When the root ends in a consonant, ta may be joined by the means of an interceding I, or it may be assimilated, and unlike ya, it's generally the t sound which is duplicated. But to save time, I'm not going to go into that here. And finally, roots ending in r, n, and sometimes ung generally drop this final consonant before directly taking ta. These bases are then declined. And this is the major difference between a verb and a participle. Whereas a verb is inflected to agree with the subject in number and person, past participles are declined as if they were a noun ending in a, and are inflected to agree with their subject in gender, number and case. So, in a passive sentence, the subject will always be in nominative case, and so the past participle too is always in nominative case, and so then takes an ending to match its subject in both gender and number. Let's now look at a couple of examples. Bikuhi, Gama, Pindo, Labati. Here we can see that Pindo is in nominative case and so will be the subject, whilst the double B of the verb labati is hiding the passive infix ya. So we translate this into English with a past participle. Food is obtained. Finally, we have the two prepositions from the village by the monks. Bhikkhu mago gato hoti. Here, mago, the path, is the subject, and gato, the past participle, agrees with this subject and is reinforced by the verb hoti, meaning to be. So literally this is the path is gone, and the agent is in instrumental case, so the path is gone by the monk. And finally, Evan me sutang. Hopefully you recognise this as the opening statement to many suttas. Evan is an adverb meaning thus or just so. And if we translate this word for word, we get thus by me was heard. There's no specific subject, so we can insert the word it. And rearranging we get thus it was heard by me. Okay, so that's a quick look at the passive voice. Now you might have read that Pāli has three voices: the active, the reflexive, sometimes called the middle voice, and the passive. So now we know that in an active sentence, the subject of the verb is also the agent doing the action, whilst in a passive sentence, the subject of the verb is the target of the action, and any agent is placed in a preposition. Well, a reflexive voice sentence is when the agent of the action is also the target, undergoing the action itself. So for instance with the sentence, the cat washes, the implication is it's washing itself. Now in the Pali grammar guides, you'll see that the reflexive voice has its own set of personal endings, but in practice these reflexive or middle voice endings are rarely used in the early Buddhist texts, being mainly found in poetry. But importantly, these endings have lost the reflexive meaning, and can't really be distinguished as a separate voice from that of the active. so don't get confused by these middle voice endings and the passive voice itself. So now we can summarise. In a passive voice sentence, the grammatical subject is the target of the action, and this subject is always in nominative case, whether the sentence is active or passive. And in a passive sentence, this action will be expressed by either a past participle in nominative case or a passive indicative verb. And of course, any agent of the action is in instrumental case. Well, thank you for watching. I hope that helps with your studies. Let me know in the comments section below how you're getting on with Pali. If you haven't done so already and you enjoyed this video, then feel free to subscribe. And here are some more tutorials in which you might be interested.